This is lesson 92, and we're looking at the law of absolute and comparative advantage. Right now we're sort of going to spend a little bit of time on some technical points and with a numerical example that you just need to learn. And this is saying, basically what it says is why trade is good, and if you do trade, that will lead to an increase in output because countries can specialize in what they are best at. So for example, Germany produces really efficient, technically astute cars. The UK is very good at financial services and is good at education and music and filming and the creative industries. So every country is good at something, so let those countries specialise in what they are best at, and if you do that and trade, then everybody's going to be better off. And you have two theories. You have the law of absolute advantage, which is pretty easy to follow. The numbers are pretty easy to follow. The second one is the law of comparative advantage. The absolute key that you understand is that you trade between the opportunity cost ratios. The opportunity cost is the next best alternative foregone. Okay, so we start here with the absolute advantage, and we make some simple assumptions for this theory. There are two countries that produce two goods, and you have half of your resources in each good. So this country is twice as good at Y at producing bread, and country Y is twice as good at country X at producing jam. Therefore, it's pretty obvious that both countries will specialise. At the same time here, one bread is equal to half a jam, because if we give up 1 unit of bread, we can produce half a more jam. And here, one bread is equal to 2 jam. If we give up 1 unit of bread, we can then make 2 jam. So therefore, you trade between the opportunity cost ratios, you then specialise. So all of your resources go into making bread in this one, and all of your resources go into making your jam in this one. So we then end up with 20, 0, 0, 20. The theory, there are certain assumptions of this theory, is that there are no transport costs, and that there's no economies of scale, and that costs are constant, just to make the model work. So we do it 20, 0, 0, 20. We then trade on a one-on-one basis. So we send 10 down this way and send 10 up that way. And we have 10, 10, 10, 10. And 10, 10, 10, 10 is clearly better than 10, 5, 5, 10. So we have proven through the model of absolute advantage that trade is good. What is absolute advantage? This is when country X is twice as good, in this case, at producing bread than country Y, and country Y is twice as good at producing jam as country X, right? So this is when countries have an absolute advantage in something. So the Germans are much better than the British at producing cars. However, the British are much better at pop music than the Germans. Techno, techno, techno. Right, that's all the Germans produce. Okay. Next one on there is the law of comparative advantage. Now the law of comparative advantage says this. This is when one country is better at producing both goods. However, the other country will have a comparative advantage in one of those goods. What I'm really trying to say is one country is much better at producing one good and has only a slight advantage in the production of the other good. So going back to this numerical example again, country X is 6 times more efficient at producing bread than country Y, and country X is also more efficient at producing jam than country Y, but it is only 1.5 times more efficient. So we end up with 30, 15, 5 and 10. Once again, we do the opportunity cost ratios, which are here, 1 bread, half a jam, 1 bread, 2 jam. Then we specialise completely. So here this goes to 30, that goes to 60, 0, 0, 20. The problem here is that we don't have quite enough jam to go around. So we did have 25 units of jam, and now we have 20 units of jam. So we still want to produce as much jam, because bread without jam isn't as tasty, I suppose. So what we then have, we have partial specialisation, okay, on here. So we end up with 50, and we still make 5 units of jam, and country Y stays exactly the same. What we then do is we then trade between the opportunity cost ratios. Sorry, I should put on here partial specialisation. So we trade on a one-on-one basis again, and when we do that, so they send 10 lots of bread down here, and they send 10 lots of jam up there. We end up with 40, 15, 10, 10. Now clearly, once again, we have proven that through trade that there is a rise in output. And that's the whole purpose of the theory, to show that through trade is good because we can produce more goods. But we know that anyway. So not technically, that is the technical part. In theory, this is why trade is good, because we get a wider choice of goods. That's good. We can now get a wider choice of cars to buy. We get lower prices because other countries are so much more efficient at producing those goods than we are. We can exploit comparative advantage. We exploit this theory here, which shows it leads to a rise in output. Dynamic efficiency, all these countries compete with one another, so that creates more efficiency because you have to innovate to survive. One of the key themes on this course. And lastly, if you look at China, they have export-led growth. Now, the example of why trade is always a good thing, people always use the example, well, let's look at North Korea. It's not open to any ideas at all, so therefore trade is good. Okay, but this model is based upon certain assumptions. The assumptions are no transport costs, costs are constant, you only have two economies producing goods and half of those resources are in each good. The factors of production are perfectly mobile, it's absolutely no problem moving from bread to jam or jam to bread, and there are no tariffs or other trade barriers, and so that's the reason why trade is good. Okay, the absolute key is you trade between the opportunity cost ratios one-on-one. Learn this example. That's what I always say to my students. Learn this example. 1 year, I decided to get all their papers back. And 2 students out of the 20 had actually learned that numerical example. The others had tried to make it up on the spot, which is pretty difficult. Okay, they tend to get the absolute advantage one correct, 19 out of 20, but they tended to mess this one up. It's not that hard. Learn it. And finally, why do we trade? Well, one of the reasons why we trade is because of the theory of absolute advantage and the theory of comparative advantage, but also all these reasons on here. Wider choice of goods, lower prices, we can exploit comparative and absolute advantage, dynamic efficiency and export-led growth. Which countries have gained most from trade? Obviously China. It's got the world's biggest trade surplus. It's now got a huge sovereign wealth fund and it can now go up and buy up the world's resources, and that is economic power. First part of lesson 9. Lesson 92 again, and we're going to look at the costs of trade and also the pattern of trade. We've just looked at the benefits of trade, which is a wider choice of goods, exploitation of comparative and absolute advantage, cheaper prices, dynamic efficiency, more competition, etc. So basically trade is fundamentally a really good thing. However, there are drawbacks of it that need to be taken into account when coming to an overall decision. The first one is exploitation of resources, and I've already spoken about multinationals taking advantage maybe of less developed countries and not paying the proper price for those resources. Now they're able to do that because they have the power to move into those countries, and those countries may not have the governments to say, hell, these are our resources and they need to be looked after. Hell. All right. The second one on there is damage to the environment. Obviously, the more trade that we do more and more trade, the more resources we're using up. Resources are finite, can't even speak this morning, are finite. More global emissions, more carbon dioxide going into the atmosphere, greater threat of global warming. However, it's always possible, of course, to have sustainable developments. The third argument is there's too much power, which links in with the first one really. There is too much power held by the large multinationals, therefore they're able to go in and to dominate a country. However, things may be changing through the growth of the internet and social media and everything else, is that people may be starting to fight back in terms of what the multinationals do in certain countries. There are risks of trade, and one of the risks from trade is right now in the year 2014, Russia has power because it has resources. It has resources in oil and gas. Europe uses a lot of its gas, so therefore it is often afraid of upsetting Russia. However, if it could create its own resources through green technology, then it wouldn't need to rely on the gas, and you would solve that particular problem. So that's where trade can sometimes be a bit of a drawback. And countries can become too dependent on one good, which may suddenly fall in price. So particularly less developed countries, they may become reliant on one export, one primary product. If that good falls in price, that creates real problems for the whole economy. Or say if you have an oil exporting country, they get all their money from oil and then the price of oil suddenly drops, that can destabilize their particular country. Just basically what you also want is you want other industries to grow, and you don't want trade dominated by those countries, by those firms that are already powerful, and they have too much advantage because they have too many resources behind them, so it's very difficult to start another firm. Okay, the pattern of trade, right? What determines the pattern of trade? Well, once again, it depends on what you have in your country. It depends on the resources that you have. So obviously the oil exporting countries will export their own resources. So it will depend upon your comparative and absolute advantage. The UK has an absolute advantage in the creative industries and in pop music, so therefore it's able to export those particular goods. An interesting one is the UK now has a low exchange rate. Okay, I know recently it's gone up a bit, but basically it's fundamentally low, and that may change the whole structure of the economy, because you may get more foreign direct investment may come into your country because their money is worth more. And then when they come into your country, they also gain from a low exchange rate when they export their cars abroad. Now, therefore, over time, if you have a low exchange rate for a long period of time, hopefully what should happen is the UK economy should rebalance itself towards the manufacturing sector, which has fallen from 20% in 1992, and in the year 2014 it's now only 10%. China has loads of cheap labour, so it's going to use that cheap labour to produce loads of goods. In fact, the world's now changing, so it's Africa now has the cheapest labour in the world, and China's a little bit more expensive. So resources will eventually move out there to take advantage of that labour. And also it depends on which trading bloc you're in. So the UK does 50% of its trade with Europe. The reason why it does 50% of its trade with Europe is because we're in a trading bloc and it's a free trade area with no tariffs or quotas within that region. So that will also determine the pattern of trade. Okay, well, the big argument against protectionism is that overall it leads to a decrease in economic welfare, and we can prove it with this diagram. In fact, we can use this diagram in two ways. We can say we're going to get rid of the tariff, and then there's going to be a net gain of B&D, or we can put the tariff on, and there's going to be a net loss of B&D. You often find this particular diagram appearing on exam papers, which is fine, apart from the fact they never explain it. I'll say about 80% of the time they don't actually explain what it actually means. But this is how it works. So this is the world price here. So we import Q1, Q4, you put a tariff on the good, and we only import Q2, Q3. This is home demand and this is home supply. Now, obviously, if you raise the price, that will increase your own producer surplus for your producers in your country, because they'll be getting a higher price for each of their goods. Hence, there is a net gain for producers of area A. The government will also gain because we're now importing Q2, Q3, and we put a tariff on those goods, so that's revenue that goes to the government. However, there is a fall in consumer surplus of A, B, C and D. All this area here because the consumer now needs to pay a higher price for that good, and that is how you end up with a net loss of B and D. So that is an argument against putting a tariff on a good. But clearly if you do put a tariff on a good, then you're going to buy less of their goods, and that will improve your balance of payments. Okay, tariff. A quota is when you have a physical limit on the amount of goods that you import into your country. So this is the diagram here, this is the world price again. And if we say we're only going to limit your quota from Q3 to Q4 rather than importing Q1 to Q2, what that will do is, once again this is home and this is home again, that will raise the price because you are importing fewer goods. So the people who still export the goods to your country will actually get a better rate of return because they'll be getting a higher price for each of their goods. However, obviously there won't be as many exporters from other countries importing to the UK. That's the quota diagram on there. The subsidy diagram is very, very simple, just a simple demand and supply. If we subsidise the good, that will reduce the price of that good, so therefore you will sell more goods on the market. That tends to be a 50-mark question. Okay, how do you use protectionism? Right, so fundamentally, of course, protectionism is bad, because what happens is, right, okay, so if we're going to do it the other way around now, the producer will lose because we're now getting rid of the tariff. So the producer will lose area A, okay. The government will now lose area C because they're no longer getting that tariff revenue, but there will be a gain in consumer surplus. There will be a gain in consumer surplus of A, B, C and D. So therefore, at the end of the day, that leads to a net gain of B and D. So that's a pretty good reason against having protectionism. Okay, so there are lots of other benefits of free trade, wider choice of goods, lower prices, dynamic efficiency and all those things that we did under the benefits of trade. Okay, so from there, I keep on saying okay today, I must have an okay problem. Right, no more okays. I've just said 5, end of. Right, arguments used to justify protectionism. Well, I think a really, really strong argument is that India used a policy of inward orientation. But then there are a lot of Indians on this planet, 1.3 billion, but they decided to satisfy their own market first of all. So they built up their own industries for their own markets before they took on the rest of the world. Because basically when a new country is developing, it is going to have a lot of infant industries, and it needs to learn the necessary techniques to build up those industries so therefore that they can be successful. So sometimes if you have new industries that are just starting, then they may need a bit of help or protectionism to get started, or some government finance. And I think even with the UK, that's particularly important, because I'm obviously a big fan of green technology, so a big fan of starting up your own green technology industry, but to get it started is going to need a lot of help from the government. And I think we should do it for all sorts of reasons. One of the reasons right now, year 2014, we're importing loads and loads of gas from Russia. That therefore becomes dangerous. So it's good to diversify and to have your own forms of energy. But there's other reasons why you might have protectionism. To protect jobs, although in the UK this isn't a very good reason, because those workers should be able to find jobs in other industries. To protect against dumping, you will find a lot of countries will sell their goods at below, not a lot of countries, a few countries or a few industries may sell their goods at below cost price, so therefore they get a market in your country and then they raise the price. That's also against the laws in terms of the World Trade Organization. You may also want to protect yourself against cheap labour, but that seems to be a little unfair really. That is the way of the world, and you have to innovate to get around that particular problem. You may also actually, it's not in the textbook, but you may also decide to protect yourself. Sorry, I stood on my microphone there. You may also decide to protect yourself against a trade deficit, which the UK has a pretty large trade deficit, and it may decide that enough is enough, that therefore we need to protect our own industries and build up our own industries, and the trade deficit is a cause for concern, so we need to borrow the money to be able to finance that deficit. So you may decide to protect your industry there. However, so for someone like the UK, you could argue that really what we should be doing is having the right economic policies. We've already lowered the exchange rate by quite a significant margin. We should help the UK in terms of protectionism, but we should also be using supply-side economics, innovating and creating our own industries. But certainly maybe for third world nations, until they get going, they may need a certain level of protectionism to develop their own industries and to diversify their own industries. Otherwise, they will always be at the mercy of the major countries in the world today. Okay, so this is lesson 92, all about trade.